The scariest night of my entire life was a close encounter with a later confirmed murderer when I was camping with my boyfriend in the mountains. It ended with us running for our lives down the mountain in the pitch black, clutching knives and a hammer for self-protection. It was the end of 2018, our first getaway together as a couple. We went to the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. We were naive. We thought it would be more romantic to camp out as far off the beaten track as possible. We walked really far into the wilderness and got to a spot where nobody passed us all afternoon. We were making s'mores over the campfire after it had just got dark. It was twilight. All of a sudden, my boyfriend saw a man approaching us slowly. He was creeping up on us. At first, we thought it was a park ranger coming to tell us to put out our campfire. I began to hide the weed, thinking this was our biggest concern. My boyfriend called out to him, "Hey, can I help you?" We thought it was weird that he didn't have any kind of light on him. He didn't have any camping bag, nothing for camping. Why was he out here so far with no camping gear at night, with no light? He sped up after my boyfriend called out and came right at him. He had this strange look in his eyes. The look was absent, blank, and weird. He didn't answer my boyfriend. He just kept walking right at him. Red flags going off at this point. When my boyfriend realized that it wasn't a park ranger, he quickly put his hand in his pocket where he had a concealed knife. He made it clear that he had a weapon. It was only after my boyfriend did this that the guy acknowledged us. He said something weird. "Oh, I was just wondering if y'all were having a party." Remember, we were miles away from a single soul, and it was beginning to get dark when he began to approach us slowly without a flashlight. He had no camping gear with him, just a tiny drawstring bag on his back. After he asked what we were doing, we didn't give him any answers but asked what was going on. He didn't answer. He just looked past my boyfriend towards the site. It was windy, so we had put up a tarp to shield ourselves. This also meant that the guy approaching couldn't see how many people were at our site. He asked, "How many people you got with ya?" He began to circle our site to check us out. He asked again if we had any other people with us, and my boyfriend didn't answer. He carried on circling around our camp. Now bear in mind, we had set up our camp on this crazy steep hill. It was the only spot for miles that was possible to put a camp. However, he told us that he was going to set up camp nearby. He proceeded to walk off in that direction straight up the hill. We knew for a fact he couldn't put a campsite there because of the terrain. Remember, he had no light and no bag with camp gear. Nothing. We were silent. We listened to his footsteps on the leaves as he walked up the hill in the direction completely off the path. He walked for about 30 seconds, and then his footsteps stopped completely. He was just still, silent. We knew he was still there, but we couldn't see him. It was dark. At this point, I was freaking out. I didn't want to seem like a baby in front of my boyfriend. We had to talk about whether we needed to leave. My boyfriend handed me a knife and said, if anything happens to me, I should run. At this point, I knew it wasn't just me freaking out unnecessarily. He said that we needed to get out of there and just to grab essential items. I was scared that he was about to shoot us dead. Later on, when I told my boyfriend this, he said no. This is the type of guy who would probably prefer to stab his victims to death. We began to walk, kind of run down the trail in the pitch black with our lights off for at least a mile. My boyfriend looked back to see him staring at one point. He ran behind me to protect me. This experience stuck with me. I still can't think of a rational or non-menacing reason why that guy was out there that night. I've tried. Now this was the end of 2018, but my boyfriend, now husband, and I were remembering it last night. I decided to type in Google if there had been any murders in the same place around the same time. And there was. A few months after our incident on the same trail, an unhinged man with crazy eyes approached some hikers at twilight as it was getting dark. He behaved in a deranged and aggressive manner before stabbing a man to death with a 17-inch knife. A woman he was with ran for her life down the trail. Finally, she raised her hands in surrender, and he began to stab her. Somehow, she managed to get away. The killer carried on wandering the trail and shouted out to other campers to give him a flashlight. They didn't, thank goodness. All of these details are the same as the guy who approached us. Same age, same deranged eyes, same lack of flashlight, same time to approach us, same look, same place. The more articles I read, the more I realize this psychopath had been roaming the trails harassing hikers for a while. A few different people had reported him, not just us. Apparently this erratic and violent psychopath was well known to law enforcement along the Appalachian Trail. His name is James Sovereign Jordan. We got lucky. It could have been us.
October 10th, 1999 was just another ordinary Sunday around our house. After the four of us returned from morning services, I helped Erin, my beautiful wife, finish preparing the last few sides for lunch. Just before noon, the children were called to the table and, as usual, a great meal was had. When we were all satisfied, the kids ran off to do their thing and I assisted Erin in cleaning the table. Once I had completed my husbandly duties, I slipped away to the living room to nap for the few hours. Around 3:45, I was awakened by a phone call from my grandmother Annie, my dad's mother and the only remaining grandparent or parent on either side of my family. She had raised myself and my sister after our parents had passed, and we were all very close. She asked if I knew any young men that needed work as a repair maintenance man. Her last guy had gotten too old to do the work and she needed someone new to help around the house every once in a while. I helped her out as much as I could, but between my long hours at work and driving the girls back and forth to their various school-related commitments, I couldn't be relied on to do as much as she sometimes needed. Although I had no one in mind at that very moment, I told her that I'd put the word out and get back to her the next day. My first stop was to Erin. She had nothing for me. A few calls were made to various friends, but they couldn't think of anyone. However, they promised to get back with if the situation was to change. It was a waiting game now, so I plopped myself back down in the chair and dozed off again. A knock came at the door just as I began to drift off. The interruption annoyed me, and for a second I considered not answering it. I decided to go ahead, if just to stop them from banging on the door. When I opened it, I was met by a smiling young man holding business cards. He asked if I needed him to mow the yard. I declined his offer, but just then, Grandmother Annie's request popped into my mind. He was about to walk away until I caught him and asked him if he could do basic repairs, things like fixing broken garbage disposals. When I asked this, his eyes lit up and he said yes. In fact, he had been a Mr. Fix-It in his last job, but unfortunately there was not enough work, so he was forced to fall back on lawn mowing to make ends meet. I briefly looked him over and thought about it in my head for a moment. He seemed like a nice, well-mannered kid. He said thank you, which is more than you can say about most people these days. Finally, I told him to give me a card. I might have a steady job for him. He did, and I promised to let him know in the morning. I let him go, and I returned to the house to enjoy my lazy afternoon. The next morning, I called Miss Annie, my family's name for her, to let her know I may have somebody, and I'd be sending him over that morning. When I hung up with her, I called the young man, Mark, and gave him the address. I told him he'd be doing small repairs and maintenance around my grandmother's house. At the end of each week, he was to come over to my place and I'd pay him. Once the specifics were nailed down, he thanked me and went on his way. With that out of the way, I focused on the task in front of me and put everything else out of my mind. When I returned home that day, I rang Miss Annie up to see how Mark had done. Her report of his work was encouraging. She spoke on more than one occasion of how eager he was to do well and his great attention to detail. This news was very pleasing to hear and assured me I'd made the right decision. Life would continue as normal. That Friday, Mark showed up at 6 p.m. to get his money and thank me, once again, for the opportunity. Dinner was just moments from hitting the tables, so I had to cut our talk short. I told him to come around about the same time next week, and he took off, with what I assumed was a song in his heart and a smile on his face. This routine would repeat itself for the next several months. However, as time went by, Mark's smile would fade, and his appreciation seemed to become more of an attitude of entitlement. He got to the point where he wouldn't even say thank you, or anything for that matter to me. He'd just snatch the money from my hand and walk away. While this behavior ticked me off, I didn't have to like him, as long as he did his job. I hadn't talked to Miss Annie for a while, so one Monday morning, I gave her a ring to see how things were going. She said all was well, but I could tell from her voice something was bothering her. After a few minutes of coaxing, she admitted that Mark hadn't been doing his job as well as he had at first. Once a month or so had passed, he began making comments about money and not getting enough work. Since I was the one paying him, she had no idea how much he was making, so she said nothing. I assured her I was paying him plenty, enough money for a full-time employee as a matter of fact. He had no reason to complain. When she mentioned he would get angry toward her and it scared her, I became a little concerned. Just to calm her fears, I told her I would talk to him that Friday. Even after we hung up with one another, her remark about being scared continued to eat at me. Miss Annie was very special to me, and the idea of her being afraid made me mad. I was determined to nip his behavior in the bud, but it became a problem, but I had to make sure I did so with a clear and calm head. Anger would only serve to exacerbate the situation and breed bitterness between us. I'd cooled off by the time Friday came around. In fact, I was in a pretty good mood. Spring was just beginning to rear its head, and I was looking forward to more sunny and warm days. Mark arrived at the usual time and had the now common scowl across his face. He attempted to snatch the cash from my hand, but before he could, I stopped him and said we needed to talk. He said nothing as I spoke, just stared with an annoyed look. I finished and asked if we had a problem between us and made sure to express how serious I was. All he could say was no and assured me we were cool before he slowly reached out for the money and pulled it from my hand. This time, he at least said thank you before walking away quickly. I couldn't be positive, but things seemed to be clearer, if not better. I wouldn't know for sure until I spoke to Miss Annie that Monday, but I felt optimistic about it. Things at work were very hectic that Monday, so I wasn't able to call Miss Annie until later in the day. Strangely, I got no answer, but figured she was out or busy and I could try again later. Work got busy again, and it was not until I clocked out that I could call her back. Once again, no answer came, but I decided to let it go until the next day. Tuesday morning was much quieter around the office. I had plenty of time to make a call. For the third time, she didn't answer. Now I was becoming scared. So I contacted the police and asked if they could do a wellness check. Miss Annie was almost 80 by then, and the chance of falls were high in people that age. I was told they would and to call back in a few hours. However, it was they who called me back. The tone of the officer's voice uneased me, and he seemed to be dragging out things. This made me mad. I was already on edge from worry. Although I'm not proud of it now, at the time it was understandable. I yelled at him to spit it out, so he did just that. They had done the wellness and found Miss Annie dead. This was unexpected but not shocking. Assuming she died of a heart attack, I asked what the causes were. When he told me that she had been murdered, I blanked out for a minute. Never in my wildest fears had I expected to hear those words. He had to yell out a few more times before I responded, and even then, I felt like I was in a fog. This stuck with me for about an hour, but once I had to tell my family the news, the weight of it knocked me back into reality. The only information the officer could give me at the time was that she appeared to have been attacked by one or more people with hammers or blunt objects. If I would have had my wits about me then, the second I heard the word hammer, I could have told him who it was. But that didn't turn out to be required. I give the cop credit for being kind with his words, even after I'd screamed at him. He could tell from my hemming and hawing what I wanted to ask, and assured me that there were no signs that she had been messed with, if you catch my drift, and I thanked him later for this. The rest of the family took the news almost as hard as I did. Miss Annie had become like a second mother to my wife, and my kids loved her greatly. We'd become very dependent on her after we relocated here, and the thought of her not being around was agonizing. It took a day or two before I remembered Mark and gave him a call. I didn't answer, but after I left a message to contact me ASAP. The longer I thought about it, however, it struck me as odd that he hadn't called me. The first day he received no answer at the door. He should have called me. My confusion would grow into full-blown suspicion once I discovered two important things. The pathologist determined Miss Annie had died sometime before noon on Monday, and perhaps the more scary of the two, Mark was still unreachable. The results came in that Friday morning, and the cops had been to his home twice and called him every day since I mentioned him to them on Wednesday afternoon. I expected to see him that evening to get his pay, but he never showed. This all but cemented his guilt in my mind. I told the police as much, and over the following weeks, they would come to agree with me. Other than having his fingerprints and blood at the scene, everything pointed to him. All they had to do was get him in a room alone, and hopefully he would confess, but just locating him to do this would be a 5-year struggle. Countless tips were sent in, but none would pan out. Finally, on a rainy and cold morning in January of 2006, an arrest would take place across the country in Arizona that would put the search to an end. The Tucson police would be led on a high-speed chase after attempting to pull a man over for expired plates. At the end of the chase, Marco Javier Robles would be apprehended, and our search would finally be over. Marco was quickly extradited back east, and the trial was soon to begin. What we feared would be a long and drawn-out affair ended within the week. The district attorney had offered him a very generous plea, and after a strong recommendation from his attorney, he agreed. He'll have to do at least 25 years, but after that, it's up to the parole board. If I have any sway in the matter, I'll do my best to see that he dies in there. We were left with only one question. Some would say the most important one, perhaps. Why? As a stipulation to his plea, Mark was required to tell why he committed the crime, and in full. According to him, Miss Annie had become very demanding, and he felt he wasn't being paid enough to put up with it. He had been planning on hitting me up for more money once summer came along. However, when he found out she had told me that he was unhappy with his pay, in his eyes, his chance for a raise was ruined. That Monday morning, he was angry about this and confronted Miss Annie about what she had said, and a fight broke out. He claimed she grabbed a poker from the fire set and hit him. In self-defense, he struck her with his hammer, but only did so once. His intent was never to end her life, only to make her stop. Unfortunately, it did just that and more, and my family will never be the same because of it. A less rational man than myself would probably put some, if not all, the blame onto myself for hiring the guy. I, however, am not that man. No one else but Mark is responsible for Miss Annie's death. Any other conclusion would be foolish and a desecration to her memory. If there is anything I would say I feel guilty about, it would be that my children weren't able to spend as much time with her as I did growing up. A better example of selfless love and kindness never existed, and I savor every memory I have of her. I hope I can live up to her example and teach my children to be half the human being she was.
I'm originally from Arizona, but I grew up in Nebraska, in a small town about an hour south of the South Dakota border. My life leading up to my living in Nebraska was riddled with abuse and a lot of childhood trauma. My biological father was abusive, and my mother was absent for part of my childhood. I am also bipolar and take daily medication to make my quality of life better because of what happened to me as a child. I currently reside in Oklahoma. To start, I never really experienced anything paranormal growing up. That is until my mom's boyfriend, whom she is still with to this day, came into our lives. He was a good man and ran a small hardware store at which my mom also worked. Before meeting him, she was married to an awful man that did terrible things to me, many of which I still go to therapy for to this day. After the divorce, we spent a lot more time at her boyfriend's house. The house was built in the early 1900s, and it was absolutely huge and beautiful. She never told us at first that it used to be an old mortuary. Her boyfriend's father, who moonlighted as a mortician, ran the hardware store in town, which was passed down to his son upon his death. Even after telling my brother and I, my brother being 12 and I 15 at the time, that the house was an old mortuary, it never really bothered us. We spent our summers there swimming and playing PlayStation 3, and genuinely having a good time. Quite honestly, the best summers of my teen years. I enjoyed it. The home was warm and inviting. That is, until you got to the basement. The steps leading down to the basement were steep, about 10 of them before you reached the bottom. The basement had flooded many times before, so there was no carpet, just cold cement. Immediately to the right was a refrigerator, the washer and dryer, and the cubicle shower, which was flush against the wall and was positioned so it was directly behind you when you came down the stairs. If you walked forward, there were 2 couches positioned in an L shape to the right. The longest one pushed against the west wall. To the left were 2 brick pillars that acted as support beams for the house, spaced 5 feet apart with a dirty old blanket hanging between them as a shield. Behind the blanket was a vertical rectangle of a room. One half was a wooden workbench of old tools and trinkets, a random toilet that actually worked, and in the far left corner of the rectangle was a small pile of remnants from when the house was an acting mortuary. There was a bathtub, no longer operational, piles of wood shelving, and a small metal table on wheels. I always felt anxious going into the basement. I never could figure out why, but the atmosphere down there made me feel uneasy. I would sometimes come down to the basement to get a soda from the refrigerator, and I always had the feeling of static across my back, my neck, and my shoulders. It would make my hair stand on end, and I never walked up the stairs like normal people do. I walked backwards, because there was always the feeling of someone right behind you, making your fight or flight response kick in. It was definitely not my favorite place to be. My first encounter happened when I saw a shadow dart across the wall as I came down to get a soda. I knew the shadow wasn't my own, and I even tried to duplicate it, but I couldn't. The shadow passed along the ground level window almost 8 feet up. There's no way it was mine. I left quickly and slammed the door shut behind me, but the main incident that cemented my belief in the paranormal happened when I was 15. I had just gotten back from swimming all day, and I was sunburned and looking forward to rinsing off. But of course, the only shower in the house was, you guessed it, in the basement. I grabbed some clothes and headed down to get it over with. I didn't want to be down there longer than I had to. I grabbed a towel from the wire rack above the washer and dryer, turned on the water, got undressed, and hopped in. The glass in the little shower was tempered, meaning you could see blobs of shapes and colors, but no real definition. I was rinsing off and proceeded to close my eyes and put my head under the stream of water. I moved out of the way, wiped my eyes, and opened them. I froze. Through the glass, I could see someone standing there to the left. My mom was upstairs taking a nap, and my brother was on the second floor playing PlayStation. There would be no reason for either of them to be down there, especially standing still looking at me. I stared at the shape through the glass. That feeling of unease came over me again, but stronger this time. I stood there for a moment, gathering up the courage to open the door. Slowly, I pushed it open, never taking my eyes off of the figure. But when I opened the door, there was nothing. No one was there. I looked around, surveying the area, and when I was satisfied that I was alone, I closed the door, and the figure was gone. I hurriedly finished my shower, threw on a towel, and started to back up the stairs. Every step I took, I could feel the sense of unease growing, like an unseen mass filling the room. This happened many more times over the next few years, but I continued to see the shadow. I did my best to ignore it, but the feeling of unease never wavered. I never showered with either the basement door or the shower door closed again. Water on the floor be damned. When I was little, like 6 or 7, I had dreams that I would wake up late at night and see my mom smiling and standing in the darkness of my bedroom, watching me sleep. I would call out to her, but she couldn't hear me. She would just smile and look at me. This was a recurring dream for years, and it was beyond terrifying. When I was about 11, my parents separated, and I went to live with my dad. Although I had told my friends about these dreams, for some reason, I never talked about it with my dad, until this one random night that we were eating dinner. I asked my dad what he thought the dreams meant. He stopped eating and sat there for a minute, and then finally said, "You weren't dreaming, buddy. Your mom has had mental problems her entire life. She loves you very much, but you weren't dreaming. She would go into your room and watch you sleep sometimes." This sent a shiver down my spine, and after a minute or two, we resumed eating. That night, while laying in bed, I realized something. Why did my mom not respond when I called out to her? She would just stand there and smile at me. The time this story happened was only a year ago, me being 15 and living with, at the time, just my mom and my 10-year-old brother. My dad was staying somewhere else for the time being. At this time in the story, we were moving from house to house, financially not very stable, but getting by. We had found a house conveniently right next to one of the largest cemeteries in town, and I didn't mind it, but both my brother and my mom found it creepy. The house had 3 stories if you included the basement. Something about that basement scared me. It always felt like something or someone was down there, and that whole year we lived there, I never stepped foot down there. Not once. To give some context, my room was upstairs. There were 3 rooms up there, and I'll tell you how it looked for the sake of the story. There was the staircase that went up to a landing, and then a smaller staircase leading to the 2nd floor. My room was the first thing that you saw. My brother's room was to the right of it, and the extra room was to the left. My mom kept the extra room locked, saying that it was unsafe to be in there. Everything about this house felt wrong. According to both of my parents, the house was extremely old, being built in the 1800s. It was freaky. All the doors had those creepy old keyholes, and the way that the house was structured seemed unnatural and weird. The turns and placement of rooms was odd, only making the house seem creepier. I never minded it until this happened. I had been texting my friend Chloe before deciding to set my phone down and finally get some sleep. I don't remember what time it was, but it was late. I fell asleep rather quickly, being worn out from school and stress. However, I'm a light sleeper. Any noise could wake me up. I was turned on my side facing the wall when I heard the loud creaks of the stairs. The steps stopped at the landing, creaking ever so slightly, as if someone was rocking on their feet. I ignored it, but it did make my heart race as I heard the steps begin again, stopping at the top of the stairs. It was probably my brother. No big deal. Closing my eyes, I heard my door creak open, and footsteps come into my room, stopping at the edge of my bed. Someone was standing over me, just watching. A bit freaked out, I did a side glance, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw my brother standing over me. and letting out an annoying grunt, I asked, "What do you want?" There was no response. Sighing and closing my eyes, I rolled onto my side. I opened my eyes to look at him again, and my heart stopped. He wasn't there. Standing up, I trudged to his room, but he wasn't there. No one was there. After that, I felt uneasy as I turned to go back to my room, but I froze. That door that was always locked was open. Did he go in there? I remember going in and grabbing my phone, turning on the flashlight and just standing there, staring at my floor. Something felt so wrong. My gut told me that I wasn't alone. There was someone in there with me, and they were not good. Slowly, I went to shine my light into the room to see if my brother was there. There was nothing. At this point, I heard my heart pounding in my ears as I shut the door, quietly going back to my room. I told myself it was my imagination as I laid back in bed and closed my eyes. I fell asleep eventually, silently muttering prayers under my breath to put my mind at ease. I did question my brother the next morning if he had gone upstairs, but he just told me no. Ever since that night, every night I hear footsteps coming from upstairs, and they stop at my door. I began to have nightmares of a very tall man coming up from the basement and to my door, peering his pale face inside to look at me with his unnaturally wide and terrifying smile. Not only that, but the door that my mom kept locked since then would be found wide open almost every morning I woke up. Something was wrong with that house, and I'm just glad we don't live there anymore. When I was 14, I was sent to a mental institution. Here's why. I don't have any friends, and I kept to myself. I loved to look at pictures of dead people, and to be honest, I still do. My parents struggled with trying to make me act normal, and I have no explanation for you or for them. I didn't like other kids. I didn't like anyone, not even my parents. The only person that I did like was my little brother Harold, who was just like me. He was quiet and he didn't have any friends either. We would play outside and hang out all the time, and everything was great. Until this one night. Harold and I got into an argument, and he told me that he wished he could kill our parents. I wasn't close with our parents, and like I said before, I didn't even like them. But I never felt like hurting them. Harold told me that not only did he want to hurt them, he wanted to cut them open with the pocket knife in the garage. He wanted to take the knife and slit them open. This made me cry. I ran to my parents' room, probably like 2 o'clock in the morning, screaming and crying. Harold followed me and was screaming that I was lying over and over. I screamed and told my parents what Harold said and what he wanted to do. My mom started crying uncontrollably, and my dad started breathing really heavy. Obviously, what I told them was scaring them, and Harold was crying too at this point. The next day, my dad took me to the mental institution. For the longest time, I was in that hospital, angry, not understanding why I had to live there and Harold didn't. It wasn't until 7 years later that I learned why. My dad came to visit me one day, and when I asked about Harold, as I always did, he finally said it. Harold didn't exist. I ran into their room that night, screaming and arguing with myself about how I wanted to kill them, but I didn't want to. This was out of this world, insanely scary. Please forgive the short length. Not much happened. I was 11 years old, living in Boston with my dad. I woke up one night super late for an unknown reason. You know how sometimes you just wake up, look around your room, and then fall back asleep? Yep, that's what happened. I woke up not sure what time, but sometime in the middle of the night. I was looking around the room, and sitting in the darkness of my open closet, I saw a face. A face I had never seen before. Someone was sitting in my closet looking at me. The ability to move my limbs completely left me. I was frozen. I stared at this person for what felt like an hour. Trying to remember now, I'd say it was really only about 20 seconds. Whoever it was reached their arm out of the darkness in front of them and slid the closet door closed, looking into my eyes the entire time. The door closed, and I lay there frozen for probably another 20 seconds. And then I realized I had to leave this room. Obviously, there was no way I was going to go back to sleep. I got up as silently as I could and walked out of my bedroom, which the door was cracked open. I ran to my dad's room and went inside. I woke him up, and naturally he was shocked when I told him that someone was in my closet. He told me to stay in his room, and he went to check. The thought of something happening to my dad scared the hell out of me, so I was crying, waiting for him to come back. After a minute or two, he finally came back and told me that no one was there. Cliché ending, I know. I will say this, I do not care if people believe me or not. It really happened. I was not dreaming. When I left my room, whoever it was in the closet left as well. The front door, the back door, and most of our windows were all unlocked. Stupid, I know, but we were ignorant. This happened 6 years ago, and when I try to remember the face, I can't visualize the details, except one thing. One thing I have always been sure of. It was a man, and he was missing teeth. How do I know? Because he was smiling at me the whole time. This incident took place around 6 months ago on an overnight trip into the Superstition Mountains, which are about an hour drive east of Phoenix. I'm not going to specify the exact trail because I've been doing this stuff long enough to realize what happens when you say too much. Whether it's a good trail, abandoned mine, ghosts, or whatever it might be, people come flocking, and usually with a lot of trash and loud music. This particular trail I was taking was an 8-mile loop through a canyon, a pretty simple overnight trip. I had planned to go with my friend, but at last minute he canceled, and he left me on my own. So with a packed bag and a car ready to go, I decided to go on my own. Not leaving the house on time and some trouble navigating rough forest roads, I didn't arrive to the trailhead until around 5:45, which for those of you who don't backpack, this is a very big no-no. I had about a 4-mile hike until I arrived at my planned camping spot, and it was getting dark fast. So I figured if I moved quick enough, I could get at least 2 to 3 miles in before I had to find a spot. This strategy left me hiking a very dark trail on my own with about 15 miles of dirt road between me and anyone else. Hiking in the dark by itself is scary, especially for where I was and being on my own. Eventually it got so dark that I could only see where my headlamp was pointing, and that's when I figured I needed to stop and get a camp set up. With only using the headlamp as my light source and trying to move fast, I ended up in a less than ideal spot, but there were some burnt pieces of wood and the remains of a fire circle, so it looked like people had been there before, but it didn't look recent. My first priority was to get a fire going. I scanned the area around me and was able to find some dry wood, and I got the fire going. I got my tarp set up and cracked an open can of chili mac I had brought for myself and was very much looking forward to eating. I was feeling good. My camp was set up and my food was on the fire. The feeling of uneasiness from the hike had almost gone away, but it was still there. The side effect of camping alone in a remote area. To fully understand what happened, I have to explain to you how my camp was set up. The site I had picked was a small clearing surrounded by large pine trees with the trail about 30 feet to my left. When you're in the woods and have a fire going, the fire casts a circle of light around it, and everything in the edge of that circle and past it are pitch black. I was sitting on the ground near my fire eating my dinner when a small rock, about the size of a marble, was thrown into my camp. I looked in shock as I was positive that I was the only person on this trail that night. I immediately turned my light on and towards the area where I had seen the rock come from, but due to the density of the pines and the brush, I could only see about 10 feet. I spent the next 15 minutes in disbelief as I scanned in the tree line that surrounded me, searching for whoever had thrown the rock, not daring to stray too far from my fire, that in hindsight offered me a false sense of security. After sitting back down and spending the rest of my time on high alert, I was able to convince myself that I had somehow kicked the rock, or it had fallen from a tree or something. I went to sleep that night not expecting the pure terror that was about to unfold. I awoke to the sound of rustling leaves, barely inaudible if you weren't listening for them, but they were there. Still in a sleepy daze, I listened, as the rustling of leaves got harder to hear, as I assumed they were moving away from me. I went to grab my handheld flashlight that I had left next to me when I had fallen asleep, but the more I looked, the more scared I got as I came to realize that it was no longer there. I stood up in my sleeping bag and ducked out of my tarp and looked around. I was able to see a light off in the woods. It couldn't have been more than 15 feet away. It was my flashlight, laying on the ground in a pile of leaves. This is one of those few moments in my life where I've almost crapped my pants. The flashlight that I had left sitting right next to me when I had fallen asleep a few hours ago was now 15 feet away, in the tree line of the woods. I hurriedly slipped my boots on, clutching my knife in my other hand and keeping my head on a swivel. I weighed my options: stay here and wait out the night, or attempt the 3-mile hike back to the car in the dark. I figured that whoever was out there with me was definitely going to have a better advantage if I was out on the trail without a light, so I decided to stay at the camp and wait out the night. Eventually, whoever it was came back. I could hear them walking around the woods. It was far off, but I could hear them. It sounded like someone leisurely walking by, like they were on a stroll, without a care in the world. Sometimes they would walk so far away, and I would lose the sound of their steps. But then, an hour later, maybe 2, they would return, still faint. This went on for 3 or 4 hours until I listened to the steps get closer and closer, until they were about 7 feet away from me. At this point, the fire had gotten very small, as I had run out of wood in my pile. The footsteps stopped, and everything went totally silent. I sat there still, for 2 hours, clutching a knife in my hand, and prayed that I wouldn't hear anything else. I stayed like that until the sun cast enough light that I could see that I was alone in my campsite. I packed my things and speed walked the 3 miles back down the trail I had taken. I arrived at the empty dirt road where my car was parked and nearly sprinted to it as I unlocked my Subaru, jumped in, and drove, and didn't stop until I had put at least 20 miles between me and that place. I stopped at a gas station to buy a Red Bull, but mostly just to see or talk to another person. As I exited the store, I was able to read what someone had written in the dust on my back window. Sleep well. A lot of weird things have happened to me on my various adventures through Arizona, but this is the weirdest and the scariest by far. There was somebody seriously deranged in the woods that night. Do yourself a favor and stay as far away from those mountains as you can.
I've heard a lot of stories here, in which individuals have discussed some of the most scary and horrible things that have happened to them in their lives. A lot of them have sounded like they were very traumatic at the time in which they occurred, but a small amount wasn't even half as bad as the person thought it was. I'm sorry, but if you have to get therapy for the rest of your life because your boyfriend slapped you, you have much bigger problems than your choice of men. I don't want to be mean, but many people make things into being far bigger than they really are. Half of the things I've heard recently have been the textbook definition of first world problems. If you want to hear a recounting of a real horrible event in which I was involved, pay close attention. At 16, I was emancipated from my parents because of repeated abuse suffered by me and my sister. While my sister, who was only 12 at the time, was sent to live with our aunt, I moved into an apartment with my boyfriend. Despite it being terribly hard to find a job at that age to pay my bills, I did it, and I don't mean by selling myself like many of the runaways and the street girls I had met. Even though it meant we didn't get to see much of each other, my boyfriend's job at his family's company allowed us to live a stable and happy life. A life far better than I'd ever known growing up. My 17th birthday was the first year I'd ever received an actual present that wasn't purchased at a dollar store or shoplifted from Goodwill. My only regret at the time was that I couldn't bring my sister along with me, but the judge felt I was too young to handle such a large responsibility. I've been raising her for as long as I could remember, but he didn't want to hear it. August 14th of 2005 was my sister's 13th birthday, and I wanted to buy her something really special. A few days before her party, Brendan, my boyfriend, and I had a rare day off together, and he volunteered to drive me to the mall to get her a gift. Since he was the one doing the driving, we had to take his beloved BMW M3 that his dad had bought him for his 16th birthday. There were many times I truly believed that he loved that car more than me, but the pettiness of thinking that made me ashamed. He dreamed his whole life of owning one of those cars and had been working any job he could get since he was 12 to save money for one. He'd no doubt earned it, but this fact was sometimes lost on me. Any of you ladies out there who has a man that seems to love his car more than life itself will hopefully understand the petty jealousy I often felt towards his. It wasn't out of the ordinary to have guys approach him and tell him how cool the car was. I think he liked the attention the car got, and it got him. The second we parked, I could tell the two men were lusting over the M3. It became very obvious quickly that I wasn't what they were eyeballing. I continued to watch their focus, and it never broke from that car for a second. Unfortunately, the two stores I checked didn't have what I needed. Brendan and I stopped to have a slice and then headed back to the car. As soon as we exited the mall, we saw the two guys I'd noticed earlier, standing around the car like they were waiting for us to return. The time was approaching 9 p.m. and it was already getting dark. The parking lot was almost completely empty. As we got closer to the guys, I started to get a weird vibe from the two. Their body language was tense and unnatural, and as they spoke to each other, they would laugh in an obviously uncomfortable manner, almost like they were attempting to soothe their nerves. I assumed this was because they were a little younger than Brendan and nervous about talking to him. When I got to the car, I went around to the passenger door to get in like normally. Brendan said hi to them and asked if he could help, in a friendly manner. The taller of the two asked him if the car was for sale. None of the guys came off as aggressive in any way at this point, and Brendan was never anything other than respectful to them. He didn't have to think about the offer. His answer was a brief, matter-of-fact no. Thinking it ended right there, he began to turn his back and get in the car, but apparently that wasn't good enough for the guy, and he must have felt Brendan should rethink the offer. He grabbed Brendan as he turned. "Hey, don't turn your back on me. I wasn't finished talking to you. The rich boy thinks he's too good to talk to us." When he said the last part, he was facing his friend. Being no stranger to people with aggressive attitudes, a sick feeling grew in my stomach. Brendan did his best to defuse the situation, but it quickly became clear that the dude wanted a confrontation. Once more, this time around in a far more aggressive manner, he asked Brendan if he wanted to sell the car, and once again, he did his best to decline the offer in a friendly way. Then the guy changed tactics and demanded that Brendan give him the car. When he said this, I started to feel very scared. This idea must have struck him as insane because when Brendan heard it, he began laughing uncontrollably in the guy's face. His expression showed just how angry Brendan's reaction made him. This was when he pulled the gun and stuck it in Brendan's face. My body began shaking the second I saw it. Now it seemed we were getting to the actual goal of this exchange. We were going to be robbed. I glanced over at the other a-hole standing at the back of the car. His rotten teeth-filled smile made the bile rise up from my stomach and into my mouth. Just the taste almost caused me to vomit, but I managed to stifle it back. His buddy with the gun told Brendan, through gritted teeth, to laugh in his face again. Wisely he didn't. He attempted to de-escalate again by trying to reason with the guy. He told him that the car wasn't actually as great as it looked. The fact was that it cost a lot of money to maintain, but the guy said nothing. I saw Brendan's expression change at this point. It was a look I'd only ever seen once. He was terrified and knew he was in trouble. This desperation caused him to do something very foolish. When the guy looked back toward his partner, Brendan grabbed for the gun. They began fighting for control of it, and soon fell on the ground out of my sight. I was afraid the guy's partner would rush to help him, so I rushed him instead. It didn't take long for him to throw me off. Just as I landed, I heard the shot. It made me jump. I had to see if anyone had been hurt. When the guy with the gun ran past me to his car, followed by the other, a horrible feeling came over me. Even before I'd seen him, I knew Brendan had been shot. Honestly, I was too terrified to look, but I knew I had to. What I saw would take away my will to live for many years to come. He was lying flat on his back, writhing silently in pain and staring hopelessly into the starless sky. I shuffled over to him as fast as possible in a vain attempt to stop the blood pouring from his stomach, doing my best to make his end as peaceful as possible. I held him and sang quietly to him as he slowly bled out of my arms. I'm not really sure how long we stayed there. Does it really matter? I'm sure he'd already been dead for some time when the ambulance and police showed up. Those monsters ended his life for this stupid car. In the end, didn't even bother to take it with them when they left. What a waste. If anybody reading this cares about what happened to the two guys, I have 2 words for you. Not much. The shooter was able to cut a deal on a lesser charge and is scheduled to be released sometime next year. As for his little buddy, his age at the time and it being his first conviction was taken into consideration. The yuckmouth sleazoid only served 5 years with an additional 10 of probation. If you've done the math, you realize he'll be free and clear himself soon. No 2 men in the history of crime got off so easily. If I would have been born a man, I would have committed a crime just in the hopes I'd be put in the same place as one or both of them, so I could break a shank off into their guts and watch them bleed, just as I had to watch the only man in my life who has ever treated me with respect or love. It's painfully clear that I still have a long way to go before I'm able to put this behind me, if I ever can. If you've made it this far, then maybe you can now understand even a little why I've criticized some of the other submitters of these stories. However, maybe due to my stubborn determination to deal with Brendan's death myself, I've ruined my chance to move beyond it. Perhaps then, getting to the place in my life where I'm able to share this story with another person was assisted by those very same people I criticize. I'm still not sure. The last 14 years have been a long series of ups and downs, and I'm still very confused about much of it. Regardless of my petty sniping, I thank everyone who's had the bravery to publish their terrible times. I'm only here because of you. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video.
My friend and I both planned on watching our high school basketball team playing a really big tournament game. He lived literally less than a mile from the arena where the tournament was being held. We both agreed that 5 o'clock was a good time to go walk over there together as we both didn't have a car. And that was a good time to get good seats as the arena would be packed around 6:30. Around 4 o'clock that day, I was at the shopping center that is about 2 blocks away from his house. 4:35 rolled around, and I started to leave the shopping center and walk my way over to Shane's house. On the way there, I had the sudden urge to piss, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold it. It felt like an eternity, but I arrived at his street at 4:45, and I felt like my bladder was about to explode. As I got there, I realized how spaced out the houses are from one another, so finding a private place to urinate seemed impossible. However, I finally found a very large bush in front of a house that was for rent around half a mile down from Shane's house, and I looked around for anyone that would be standing around. Nobody was there. Relieved, I began to use the bathroom. I hear someone from a short distance walking. Embarrassed, I quickly zipped my pants up and looked back. It was an older man, probably around mid-50s to early 60s, about 5'8" and 150 pounds, wearing an outdated style pair of overalls and a red baseball cap. He was staring at me intensely, as if he were mad at me for some reason. While walking in my direction, I began to walk in the direction of Shane's house, which was the direction that the man was coming from, and I was passing him. I realized that he had 2 little boys with him, both around the ages of 10 to 12, along with a dog that was attached to a leash. I didn't think much of them until I heard a door swing open aggressively and someone yelling, "Hey, come back here." I looked back and saw that the man was armed with a rifle. He started running toward me, and I instantly started running faster than I thought humanly possible. He was about 2 car lengths behind me, and I could see Shane's house coming up. I looked back and saw my life flash before my eyes when I saw him starting to point the rifle at me and fire a shot that barely missed my left side. I yanked Shane's door open and slammed it shut, locking it in the process. Shane came running from his room, asking if I was okay and what happened. I told him everything while out of breath from running so much, and he was freaking out. Shane ended up reporting the incident, and when the police came back, they found no one. The man was gone. It turns out the house was up for rent for the past 6 months at the time, and has been vacated since then. I gave them a description of the man again, and that was that. Surprisingly, Shane wanted to go to the basketball game anyway, but I didn't want to go anymore. However, I didn't want to just leave him there by himself, so I reluctantly went. Shane and I ended up needing to get a ride, as we both knew it wasn't safe to go outside and walk over there. It was getting a little late out there, and friends were waiting for us to show up at the arena. While we were there, I had a hard time enjoying the game, as I couldn't shake off the fact that I could have lost my life back there. And if it wasn't for Shane's front door being unlocked, I probably wouldn't be here. My name is Nicole, and I'm 16 years old. During my freshman year, I would walk to and from school. I didn't take the bus because I got bullied a lot, so I walked to help clear my mind and just relax. I took the same path every day, which was passing by some old buildings, a daycare, and an empty parking lot. I did that a lot for about 5 months. I was leaving my apartment and walking towards the back of the buildings, as it was faster, when I ran into this man. He looked to be in his late 20s, had a white shirt on, and was bald. He said hi and be careful. It was pretty random, but I blew him off. I kept walking for about 5 minutes and I got to the old buildings, and a white truck pulled up next to me. I turned and I saw it was the same man. He asked me if I needed a ride and I said no. He said, "Are you sure? I know you go to that school down the road and in the 10th grade. It won't be a bother." And my heart sank. I'd never seen this man in my life, and he knew what school I went to and what grade I was in. I declined again and he drove off. I didn't tell my mom about the incident. I just kept walking to and from school. A week passed and I saw him again by the old buildings. It was foggy and raining outside, and he pulled up next to me in the same white truck. He rolled down the window and asked, "Do you need a ride, sweetheart? You're going to get all wet." And I said no thanks and continued to walk faster. He started to follow me and kept saying things like, "Come on, it's cold, and I know you don't want to walk out there. It's just a 2-minute drive, you'll be fine." I turned and told him to leave me alone, and that I had to get to school. I guess me raising my voice and saying what I had to say made him mad. He put the vehicle in park and opened the door. My heart sank and I froze. I couldn't run. I couldn't speak. I was in shock. He started walking toward me, and then an old man walked out of nowhere and said, "Hey Cassie, I didn't see you all day yesterday. You didn't show up for work and I was worried. Can you help me with something really quick?" It was the man from the store. I understood what he was doing. I turned and the man with the white truck ran back to his truck and took off. I started crying as the old man told me he had saw what happened and had to spring into action. I thanked him and called my friend to drop me off at school. Later on that day, I had forgotten about the incident until my teacher pulled me out of class. He told me that when he was driving into work, he saw what had happened and how the man had been following me. He took me to the front office and had to make a report and call my mom to inform her what happened. The police said they would look into it, but they never found the man. I would have given them the plate number, but at the moment, when it all happened, I hadn't thought of that. I'm a sophomore now, but I don't walk to school anymore after that. In fact, I don't really go outside of my apartment at all. I often think about what would have happened if that old man never came out the store and what the guy in the truck would have done to me. I'm 25 now, but this story happened when I was 16. I was camping with my dad and my twin sister at Cross Lake, Alberta. We will call my sister Mary and me Tilly. Mary and I are not identical. She is taller, blonde, has dark blue eyes, and tan skin. I'm shorter with icy green eyes, fit and not as tan. It was midnight when Mary and I went looking for an outhouse to use before going to bed. We were walking down a path with a lantern when we saw another light heading toward us. We walked past a guy that looked to be in his late 20s, giving us a smirk. We chuckled as we continued down the path when Mary decided to look one more time. When she looked back, she saw him still standing there with the same smirk on his face, but this time it was more sinister. She froze in her steps, pulling my arm to get me to stop with her. The stare down between us three was so intense that I just wanted to go back to our campsite just so I could pee in the trees. What happened next made my heart stop. The strange man slowly started walking toward us. He then turned off his lantern so we couldn't see him. This made Mary and I run as fast as we could. We can hear the man's footsteps getting closer as he was letting out crazy laughs. The path we were on split off in two different directions. Mary turned right with the lantern and I turned left with nothing but fear. The path ended up taking me near the beach of the lake. I kept running until I can see an outdoor change room, where I ended up hiding. It didn't have doors, but I could see through the holes through the wooden walls by using the light from the moon. I sat there in silence for what felt like forever, and was convinced that he must have stopped chasing me a while ago. I took one more glance through the hole in the wall when I heard the man's voice behind me say, "Don't be scared of me, Tilly. I just want to keep your eyes." I screamed and ran out of that room, but he caught me and threw me onto the floor. I was doing my best to fight him off. I was kicking, scratching, and crying, when unexpectedly I had dirt in my mouth. The man was trying to muffle my cries by shoving dirt in my mouth. He was then suddenly tackled off of me and began to gasp for air while being choked. I didn't know who was fighting off my attacker, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. I ran out of the change room and seen a few flashlights heading in my direction. I came to a halt when I saw Mary running out of the group towards me. Mary and I kept our distance while we seen the mob of people screaming, attempting to peel off the hero from my attacker. Through all the moving lights, I managed to see my hero, and it ended up being my father. I can't tell you the rage my dad had on his face. His determination to kill my attacker was so strong, a small group of people struggled to stop them from fighting. Finally, the camp security came and detained my attacker until the police arrived. 3 days later, my dad sits me down and tells me the information he got from the officers. It turns out my attacker confessed to stalking me for 2 months, and he wouldn't stop talking about my eyes. He has been known to stalk teen girls, and there has been some reports of him being a peeping Tom. I've never seen or heard anything else about this
This happened in 1996. I was in my mid-20s. For quick background and setting, I am a female and I was living with my parents at the time. This was prior to smartphones and I did not have a cell phone of my own. My parents' home was on a residential street in New York State. Blue-collar neighborhood, commuting distance to New York City. We lived down the street from an industrial area. A few old factory buildings that blended in with the houses and ultimately led to the town park and swimming pool, with the town dump beyond that. A strange mix of comforting suburbia and desolation. If you left my front door, went left down the block, and then hung a left at the first corner, you would be at the small gated entrance to the high school football field. The field was completely surrounded by a very tall chain-link fence with a few gated entrances. This small entrance was the only way to get into the field unless there was an event happening. The field was adjacent to the first of the factory building parking lots. I felt very lucky to be so close to the field because it had a track around it. The track ran directly around the field and separated it from the two large sets of bleachers. This was an old stadium, even in the 90s, and while the home bleachers had been updated to metal years before, the visitor bleachers nearest the entrance were still wood. The track was dirt. It was softer on the knees than concrete, so I liked to nip down there in the morning before heading to my train and do a quick 2 or 3 mile run for exercise. I usually had the track to myself in the mornings. Of course, lots of days I didn't make the morning run, so if I got home before sundown, I would head down and run in the evening. The evenings were different, usually more populated. This particular evening, I was really pushing the daylight, but I wanted the exercise. It was summer, so I want to say it was around 7:30 or 8, but getting more toward dusk. There are the usual neighborhood guys playing soccer on the field, and 3 other folks on the track walking or running. A middle-aged man, an older woman, and a woman a little older than me in a pink running suit, or maybe just pink sweats and hoodie. I was feeling annoyed because it had rained and the track was not in great shape, so there were still muddy patches and uneven parts. It was hard to keep your pace when you had to dodge them, along with watching for other people. I was wondering if the other people on the track had been there a while. Maybe they would finish up, so I could have the track to myself? That would be perfect. I was getting into it, listening to my music, and after 3 or 4 laps I looked around to see that the older woman and the middle-aged man were gone. Yes, just the soccer guys and the pink lady now. I was doing my best to keep away from her on the track. The soccer guys started to gather up their stuff and walk off the field toward the gate, at the corner by the old bleachers, dispersing back to their homes. It's just me and her now. I glanced back over my shoulder to see where she was. She was closer to me than I had thought she should be, so I picked up the pace. She can't have much longer. Maybe I'll get my last mile in peace, I think. Then, I see she is gaining on me. She's picking up her pace, and I notice she is looking at me. She's looking at me expectantly, like she wants something from me. Do I know her? I really don't want to get into a conversation right now. I go a little faster as I'm passing the home side bleachers. She breaks into a full-on sprint and is suddenly on my left, reaching out to grab my arm. I'm startled. We both stop in our tracks, and I pull off my headphones. She leans in close and says low and slow, "I was going to leave earlier, but you were still here, and I didn't want to leave you alone." Oh, great. I back up and start to cut her off and tell her that I'm fine, no problem. But then, she says it. "There's a man under the bleachers." At that point, I looked past her across the field, and I see him, sitting under the old wooden bleachers all the way at the back, against the cement wall, kind of blending in. I can make out the grayish hair, beard, and white tank top. He's just sitting there on something. A bucket, maybe? Watching. I can't stay any later, she said quietly. I have to go. Be careful. She starts to walk away. Thanks, I said. I'll walk out with you, because I have nothing to prove, and I'm going to cut my run short tonight. As we headed out of the gate, keeping an eye on the bleachers, she said something that stuck with me. She looked up at the tall fence around the narrow opening and said, "One way in, one way out." She got in her car, we waved, and I headed down the block to my house as she drove off. I told my mom about it, and we decided he may have just been a homeless man sheltering under there. I would still use the track while I lived there, but only if there were other people. I always looked under the bleachers. I never saw the man again, and I never saw the pink lady again either. I did see the soccer guys and the older woman and middle-aged man, and lots of other folks, but not her. When I think back on it, it still freaks me out that I ran past him several times that night and did not notice him. And I wouldn't have noticed him if it wasn't for that nice woman. She purposely stayed with me and made me painfully aware of how often I was running in what amounted to a cage with just one way in and one way out. When I was growing up, I lived in rural Alabama, about 30 miles north of a place called Mount Pinson. There really wasn't anything around, just houses. Nothing like a neighborhood in the traditional sense. No stores, nothing. We had one police officer, and he was pretty friendly. He was my best friend's uncle. He would often let us ride around with him because nothing really ever happened. There wasn't a recorded murder or anything beyond someone being drunk and a public nuisance. He didn't even arrest people for that. He would just ferry them home. We had this lady who was all alone. Her husband had died a few years earlier, and she was very lonely. She called this one cop over everything. If some kids were in her yard playing, she would call this cop, saying she was being harassed. She did it because she was lonely and just wanted the company. No one could figure out why she wasn't just nicer to the kids or anyone around the neighborhood. One day there was this new kid kicking around near this little spot that we liked to hang out. It had a nice climbing tree and a rope swing. My friend and I, being interested in this kid, introduced ourselves. He told us stories of living in a big city and how fun it was. We were mesmerized at the time. He taught us some new games to play. We generally had a good time. Unfortunately, his father was a real jerk. It turned out this kid was the mean old lady's grandson, and his father had lost his job and went back to stay with his mom while he recuperated. Since the kid was around, she had warmed up a little to us and would invite us over for snacks and stuff. We obliged, being kids, because we were always down for some free treats. One day, the new kid never showed up to our little spot again. We figured he was busy with his grandma and was just doing other things. A couple of days went by, and my friend told his uncle. His uncle said that he would take a look. He let us tag along because he never imagined anything weird happening. It took about 10 minutes to make it up the windy dirt road to her house. It was quicker just to walk through the field. It took maybe 2 minutes to do. Well, we got up there, and he instructed us to stay by the car, and we obliged. He knocks and knocks. No answer. Their car is there. He knocked again, this time louder. No answer. So he circled around to look in the back. My friend and I decided to try knocking ourselves. It didn't seem like a bad idea at the time. We went up to the door and knocked. Nothing. My friend grabbed the doorknob and turned it, and I asked him what he was doing, and he pushed the door open. We both almost threw up instantly. It was like the smell was a physical force and pushed up against us. It was so vile. You can't even imagine. My friend's uncle made his way around, and when he got to the porch, by the smell, he knew immediately what had happened. He instructed us to go to the car and wait. He went inside to look around, and then came bolting out of the house and threw up on the grass. He had tears in his eyes. Not like he was crying, but because he had just seen something that nobody is supposed to see. He went to his car to contact someone. My friend took off, and I went after him. He was intrigued, and so was I. I felt a little more bolder following him in. We tiptoed inside, and the first room was completely clean. Nothing to see. But then, we walked into the kitchen and saw that the kid was stuffed into the oven, burnt. He had clawed at the glass front of the door and actually scratched it. You could see his hands, his face. It looked like he was still alive, trying to get out. My friend and I just sat there, in complete shock, for what seemed like eternity. It was so surreal. My friend's uncle snapped us back to reality as he came running in the house and grabbed us, screaming, yelling, telling us never to disobey him again. He took us both outside, and we just sat there. The entire evening we didn't say a word to each other or anyone. My friend's uncle dropped me off later. I never saw my friend again. The uncle said that he couldn't handle it and went to live with some family members in the city. My family moved a year later. I've never been near that house again. The uncle ended up drinking himself to death because of depression. A farm that was near that house ended up having some sort of infestation, and they lost all of their crops. This weird circle of death seemed to expand around that house. I was 10 years old and being wheeled into the hospital late at night. Once I was inside, I remember the doctor telling my parents that I had pneumonia, and my mom started to cry. Those are the only things I remember about my visit up until I was left alone on the first night. I have no idea what time it was when this occurred, but probably very late. Everyone else in the rooms around me were sleeping, and so was I, until I heard something. I was facing the center of the room when I opened my eyes. I heard someone's shoes squeaking on the floor outside my hospital room. I turned over and saw a nurse walk by, but she had walked out of my vision, past my window before I could see her face. About 2 seconds passed, and then I saw her walk by again. This is when my heart stopped beating because of what exactly I saw. She was walking by at a very fast pace and was looking at me through the window in an exaggerated stare, meaning she was walking by, but her head turned completely to the right side as she did, not able to see in front of her as she walked, and just staring at me. Very quickly she was out of sight again, and then suddenly she started walking by again, in the opposite direction. She was walking back and forth in front of my window. This time her head turned completely to the left, again, staring into my eyes. She had brown hair that was messy, and she looked insane. On this pass, I noticed that her eyes were opened very wide. At this point, I thought my heart would explode because of how it was beating and how scared I was. Nobody else was in sight. When she walked out of my vision, 2 seconds later, she was walking by again, every time her head turned to the side looking at me. I remember thinking, even at 10 years old, that something about her was very wrong. I didn't move a muscle and could do nothing except just watch this incredibly scary woman walk back and forth in front of my window. One of the times she walked by, she was smiling, a huge, sickening smile that made tears well up in my eyes. Every time she walked by, she could not see what was in front of her, because the only thing she wanted to see was me, in my bed, through my window. It seemed like several minutes had passed, until finally she did not walk by again. She simply walked by one last time, and then was gone. I sat there in my bed and peered out my window, expecting her to walk by again at any moment. But she didn't. I must have stared out my window for the better part of an hour before my eyes got so heavy that I fell asleep. The next morning I awoke with my dad sitting in my chair next to my bed, reading a book. He smiled when he saw that I was awake, and I told him what I saw before I fell asleep that night. He didn't seem to be scared, or even very alarmed. He asked me if I was sure that it wasn't a dream. I was 100% sure then, and I am 100% sure now. The woman was real, and it happened. She was wearing the same thing as every other nurse that I saw. I was in that hospital for 3 days, and didn't see her again. I started work as a mailman a few months ago, and just last week, I had an extremely bad experience. There's this one house, every time I deliver there, I see a person watch me through their window, and I mean every single time. I had always chalked this up to be an elderly person who has nothing better to do, and after a while of it happening, it didn't freak me out as much. One day, though, I had to finish delivering mail on another carrier's route that had an emergency and had to stop early. When I was finished with theirs, I had to finish my own. As I made it to this one particular house where the person watched me every day, I saw that they were not there at the window. This made me happy, but also kind of made me nervous for some reason. I dropped the mail into their slot and continued on. I had 3 more houses before I had to return to my truck to grab all the mail for the next street. When I got back to the truck, I saw a weird-looking lady standing under the streetlight behind it. She looked like she was on drugs. She had stains all over her clothing. When she smiled at me, I noticed that she was missing teeth. She then said hello. I said it back and started gathering the mail for the next street. I couldn't see her as I did this, and I felt like she was walking up behind me. I turned around, and she was indeed closer than she was before. Standing in the street, I asked her if she needed something, and she said no. I then said back, "Okay, well, I'm going to continue on. Have a good day." With all the mail ready to go, I closed the back door, made sure it was all locked up, and started walking. I felt relieved to be walking away from this crazy-looking woman. I delivered to about 6 houses when I noticed the woman standing next to a truck in the shadows. She was following me. I'm sure that she thought that I couldn't see her there. I continued on, and after every other house, I saw that she was keeping up and trying to hide, and this was so creepy. There was nobody else around, and I felt like she would attack me at any moment. I delivered the mail to another house, and sure enough, when I walked back to the sidewalk, I could see her standing in a shadow by a big tree across the street. I decided I could not continue my night like this, and walked over to her. She stiffened up when I approached her, and I said, "Why in the hell are you following me?" She didn't respond, and instead made my heart sink as she let out a noise only a crazy person would make. A noise like she was scared of me, but it sounded really odd. She then ran away. She was definitely on some kind of drugs, and the next day when I came to that house where I would always see somebody there watching me through the window, she was there, and I know that it was her. This happened to me about 15 years ago. I lived near the ocean, and I frequented a certain spot on the beach all the time. It was a lonely spot, and not many people ever really showed up there. This one Saturday afternoon, I was laying out in the sand in my spot, relaxing and tanning like I always did. It's not uncommon for me to fall asleep. I did sometimes if the sun wasn't too hot on my skin. This one particular day, I did. I woke up a while later to the sun now setting and realized I had slept for quite a while. I looked to my left and saw a woman sitting near me in the sand, but not on a towel. She was wearing jean shorts and a bathing suit top, and she had really pretty red hair. At first, I didn't really acknowledge her, but after glancing at her a few times, I noticed that she was just staring out into the ocean and didn't turn to look at me, or anything for that matter. I felt a bit of curiosity and said hello to her. She said hello right back without turning her head to look at me. Right after that, she sprung to her feet and walked away. I thought that was weird, but didn't think anything really of it. About 30 minutes later, I packed up my stuff and left. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, and I had a great day relaxing at the beach like I always did. Once I was home, I started making myself dinner. I heard my phone ring and walked over to my purse on the counter and pulled it out. It was my mom, and we started talking about the usual things when I noticed a square folded piece of paper sticking out in my purse in the midst of our conversation. My mom continued talking, and I pulled it out and unfolded it, confused, because I was pretty sure I didn't put it there. I literally dropped the phone when I read what was written. It was a note, and it said, "I was going to rob you and stab you in the throat, but you just looked so peaceful." I picked up the phone and told my mom what happened, remembering that girl on the beach. We both nearly passed out. The following story happened when I was 16, and still to this day, I reflect on it from time to time. A bit of background. I live in Australia, and live reasonably close to a Royal National Park where this story takes place. If you aren't familiar with the park, it is a large area over 100 kilometers in space, with winding roads and nothing but brushland that are quite fun to drive through. On a night like any other, I was doing just that. I was a passenger in my friend Ash's car, and my brother Lucas was with us. It was approximately 1 a.m., and we were driving deeper into the park as we had done hundreds of times before. As we came quickly around a bend in the route, we were face to face with a girl standing at the edge of the road, close to one of those barriers, as we must be near a cliff. She looked to be in her teens. Her age I couldn't be 100% sure. Though this sounds cliché, I swear she was wearing some kind of white dress and was pale-faced. I am an avid horror movie fan, so I understand how this all sounds. Her immediate appearance wasn't what was concerning to us. We had stopped virtually in the middle of the road, and the car's headlights were shining directly on her. We became uneasy when the girl did not blink, flinch, or move a muscle, despite facing us directly. I remember wondering why she would be out here standing in the pitch black night. I can't remember if my brother or our friend suggested it, but someone said, "Should we go see if she needs help?" In that moment, so many questions were racing through my mind. I think I was the first to speak and said no, firmly. As much as I wanted to help someone, I reasoned with the boys, saying that if she was in trouble and needed help, she would have indicated it by now. I also suggested that it could be some kind of trap used to distract us, and someone could be nearby to attack us if we aided her. After what felt like hours, though really, it was only a minute, we got the hell out of there. We had to drive past her to continue our route, and couldn't do a U-turn or a three-point turn, because the road was too narrow. As we drove past her, I was in the back seat and turned my head to watch her. I still get chills when I think about this, but that girl's head turned slowly in sync with the car's movements and watched us drive away. I kept my eyes on her, and still she did not blink or move as the light around her started to dim until she was in the darkness once again, and I could no longer see her face. Oddly enough, the three of us didn't mention it the next day or for a very long time. At least I don't remember having a conversation about it with Lucas. It was only a few years later, when I had started to question if I had dreamed it, when I asked my brother and our friend if they remembered that night. To my horror, and somewhat relief, they did. They recalled the details as I had recalled them, so I knew it was real. Over the years I have wondered what became of her. I regret not going to the police, and you may ask why I would even go to the police if she had done nothing wrong. Truth be told, there are no residents that deep in the park, and she was a good hour's walk or so from the nearest highway. I have gone back to the park several times since, specifically to try to find the girl or see if there would be a common occurrence. I have researched online for any clues as to who she might have been. On one drive when I was searching, I said to a friend of mine, Nick, who was happy to come along, that there could be bodies in the brush and no one would know. A week after I said this, the dead body of a man was found a few feet away from the road in the brush by a motorist who had stopped to relieve himself. It was in the news, and it makes me wonder how many people are out there in that park. But most of all, who was that girl that we saw that night? I'm 22 years old, and this happened about 2 years ago when I was still living at my grandparents' house. This was the only scary experience that has ever happened to me, and it was a doozy. My cell phone was on the nightstand next to my bed and started ringing. It was like 3 a.m. To my surprise, the number calling me was the house phone, as in the phone downstairs. I answered, thinking that maybe one of my grandparents had hurt themselves, but when I said hello, I got no response. I again said, "Hello, Grandma, Grandpa," but again, nothing. That's when fear really hit me. I crept down the stairs, and they were really old stairs. They creaked. The whole house was dark, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't petrified of what I would find. The house phone that called me was in the kitchen, and as I reached the bottom step, I was still holding my cell phone to my ear, and whoever was on the other line was still there. I could hear them breathing lightly. I walked through the living room and into the kitchen, my heart beating out of my chest. I switched on the light, and to my relief, nobody was standing there. But at the same time, I realized that they must be somewhere else in the house. Or maybe the phone somehow malfunctioned and called the last number dialed or something? No, it was someone in my house. How did I know? Because suddenly they started laughing through the phone. I could tell it was a woman. It was my grandma. I ran upstairs to my grandparents' room, and it was locked. I could hear my grandma hysterically laughing through the bedroom door and through the phone. Panic hit me. I kicked the door open and immediately saw my grandpa shaking my grandma as she sat on the edge of the bed, holding the phone in her hand and laughing maniacally. I have never in my life seen or heard my grandma laugh like that, but it was horror movie material. She abruptly then stopped as she woke up. Both of my grandparents completely brushed it off and told me to go back to bed. But it was so insanely scary that I almost wanted to scream at them. The next morning was like any other. My grandma made me pancakes, and when I asked her about the sleepwalking or whatever she was doing the night before, she just casually said, "It happens once in a blue moon." I told her what happened exactly, beat by beat, and she responded, "Oh my, that sounds so scary." Yes, Grandma, that's a freaking understatement. One time, I drove back to college after Christmas, but before the winter break was over, so I was the first of my roommates to get back to the house that we were renting. Our house was in a pretty isolated spot on the outskirts of a town in upstate New York. I pulled into the driveway behind the house, went to the trunk, and grabbed one of my bags, and then ran inside because I had to use the bathroom so badly. I had been on the road for over 5 hours. I was inside the house using the bathroom for maybe 5 minutes. Afterwards, I went back outside to get the rest of my stuff from the car, and there were footprints in the snow all around it. Now, as I said, I was alone in the middle of nowhere. The only set of footprints should have been mine, from where I had gotten out of the car on the driver's side, walked to the trunk, and then walked to the back door. Yet now, there was another set of footprints circling the car, and then leading into the woods at the back of the property. It appeared that the footprints had originally come from the woods as well. I had left my trunk open while I was inside, because I assumed I was alone, and nothing had been taken. But someone had seen me arrive. They came out of the woods, circled my car, and then returned to the woods. I grabbed the rest of my stuff, locked my car, ran into the house, and locked the doors. Last year, the day after 4th of July, I went to my favorite lake to go fishing. Occasionally, I would take friends, but more often than not, I went alone. Unless you're fishing in the dark, nothing creepy really ever happens, and you would never expect something creepy to happen either. I went to a very specific spot on the lake where I have always had good luck catching fish. The sun was out, and it was peaceful. Nobody else in sight. That's what I really love about this lake. It wasn't too popular like some others I have been to. I was listening to an Audible book when suddenly, without hearing him at all, a man floats by in a little rowboat. I looked over at him, and he is stereotypically creepy, smiling at me and didn't say a word. To break the awkward silence, I said, "Hey, I didn't see you there," and then let out a fake little laugh. The man said nothing and just floated by. I brushed it off as he was leaving my immediate vicinity, but was once again taken by surprise when he turned around about 20 yards away and began heading towards me again. He was rowing, so it was gradual, but man, I cannot tell you the creepy feeling that came over me. I thought for sure that he would say something this time, or do something, but he floated by and said nothing once again. I have a short temper, and I got a little pissed off and said, "Do you need something, bro?" He just smiled at me. After that, I had had enough. "Dude, get the hell away from my boat." He stood up and continued his disrespectful stare. After just standing there looking at me like an idiotic psycho, he picked up the small anchor he had on his piece of crap little boat and tossed it behind him into the dark lake. I immediately stood up and started reeling in my line. A few seconds later, I put my pole down and started my motor. I looked at him one more time before I blasted away, and this guy was still smiling. I flipped him off and was gone in seconds. Well, that kinda ruined my mood, and I felt pissed off and creeped out, so I decided to call it a day. I have been to that lake 100 times since, and have never seen that guy again. And I better not either. I might just punch him in the face. I have no idea what his deal was, if he was annoyed that I was fishing in a spot that he liked, or if he was picking a fight. I have no idea. Thinking back on it, though, the whole thing was stupid, and honestly, creepy as hell. About 5 years ago, my mom started dating a guy she met on a dating site. That part is fine. I had recently started dating this woman who would later become my wife, and we had met online. My wife and I never really liked this guy. We didn't think he was mean or anything like that. Just a little creepy. He was quiet. He kept his eyes closed a lot, and occasionally said odd things, like offering my wife a chocolate, and then popping one in his mouth, closing his eyes, and moaning as he let it melt in his mouth. One time my wife and I were visiting my mom, but she got called into work, so we waited at her house. Her boyfriend was over, but he spent the entire several hours just hanging out in her bedroom with the door closed. Just before Christmas, my mom and this guy started having difficulties. My wife and I were visiting her for the holidays, and she dropped all of her problems on us, and we listened carefully and told her our opinions and suggested that she would be better off without him. She already had her mind made up though, and decided to break up with him on Christmas Eve. We spent the night at my mom's and got up early on Christmas morning to visit my dad at his house. We didn't plan to spend the night at my dad's, but we got snowed in, which was actually a nice Christmas surprise. The next day, we left as soon as we could get through the snow, and my wife suggested that we stop by my mom's house on the way so that we could see if she was okay. My wife just had a really bad feeling about my mom's now ex-boyfriend. My mom's car was in the driveway, but that doesn't mean much because she lives close enough to work that she often walks, and it hadn't snowed in her town. She also never locks her door, which drives me crazy, so we let ourselves in. That's when we see blood oozing out of the refrigerator's water dispenser. It had filled up the spill container and was leaking onto the floor and had made a puddle. My wife screamed and I freaked out. I fully expected to see my mom's head in the freezer. I nervously opened the freezer to find a bag of frozen cherries that had been opened, crammed into the freezer so that it fell onto the ice dispenser and melted. I thought my mom was decapitated by her creepy ex-boyfriend. A few years back, I lived with my mother and German Shepherd in a 2-bedroom rented townhome. I got home from work one day and went about my daily routine. When it came time to eat dinner, I knocked on my mom's door to come and eat. I smelled cigarette smoke and heard her grunt a response, so I went back down and ate alone. Fast forward to about 2 a.m. I am awoken by someone holding my hand and gently shaking it. I immediately shoot straight up and look around. My dog, who is overly protective and sleeps with me every single night, isn't in bed. She isn't even in the room. She most definitely was on my bed when I went to sleep. I sleep with the bedroom door shut and locked. She is scratching at my closed and locked bedroom door from the hallway. Frantic, I bolt for the door, let her in, and she is searching the whole room. I'm now yelling for my mother. No answer. I force my dog to walk down the hallway with me. I still smell cigarette smoke. I bang on my mom's door. No answer. So I just open it, and she isn't even home. The bed is made, and her TV is off. My dog and I search the entire house, and nothing is out of place. All the doors and windows are still locked. I was freaked out, to say the least. The next day I called my mom and she told me she left early the day before to go visit my sick grandfather. Who was holding my hand that night? Your guess is as good as mine. I used to have a penchant for wandering around abandoned buildings when I was in high school. One time a friend and I decided that it would be a good idea to explore a farmstead that hadn't been in use for years. The whole experience was really bizarre. The farmstead was accessible by a long gravel road that brought you to a cluster of dilapidated buildings around a central barn. We parked at the end of the gravel road near the turnoff to the main road so we could walk around the property and just pull out quickly later. We went into the barn first, and there were deer bones arranged in a circle around the skull, and a bunch of blankets and wood stacked in a corner of the room. We thought it was really cultish and weird, so we left and started walking back to the car. Halfway down the gravel road, we heard crunching, heavy footsteps, and someone screeching behind us. Blood-curdling screeching. We sprinted back to my car and tried to peel out of there as fast as possible, but it had snowed the night prior, and my back tire was stuck in a puddle of melted snow. My friend was screaming because she was so freaked out, but wouldn't turn to look at the path behind us. By the time I had gotten the car unstuck, she turned around to see if there was someone following us, and there was no one there. It could have been a bird or something, but we both swear up and down to this day that someone was following us. I really thought I was going to die that day.
To provide context, I'm a registered nurse in a small to mid-sized rural emergency department. I've been doing this job for about 4 years, and one of the biggest problems we've had in my time here has been the prevalence of drug abuse and mental illness. I don't live in a tiny rinky-dink town, nor do I live in a huge metropolitan area, but imagine more of a middle ground city and otherwise a highly rural area of farmlands and aforementioned rinky-dink towns. Given the size of my city, we deal with a lot of substance abuse and subsequent mental illness. The majority of cases we see are meth-induced. This is the PSA of my story where I say, please, for the love of God, for your own sake and the people you love, do not do meth under any circumstances. It will absolutely and irreparably mess your life up in so many ways. One thing that many people don't realize is that hard drug use can lead to mental illness. A lot of the times, however, it's a chicken and egg scenario regarding whether the person had mental illness prior to the drug use or whether it was the cause. On this night, one of our local EMS crews was called for a person having a drug-induced psychosis. He was brought into our psychiatric holding area, being escorted by both the EMS crew and our local police officers. One glance at this guy and I could tell he was legitimately having a psychosis. He was in his mid-40s to mid-50s, had unkempt gray hair, unshaven, tattered and dirty clothes. Imagine a movie's portrayal of the crazy homeless man archetype and he fit the profile well. In typical psychosis fashion, he was extremely paranoid and was verbally hostile towards staff in fear of what he was perceiving as a threat against his life. Everyone was patient with him and we were trying to de-escalate him without having to physically restrain him for his and our safety. But it was becoming apparent that we wouldn't be able to simply calm him down verbally. I talked to the doctor and we agreed to give him a shot of an antipsychotic. I drew it up into a syringe and headed back to the psych area. I entered the room and there were still a lot of people in there with him. We had a couple of our ER staff, at least one of our hospital security, and at least 3 or 4 police officers just trying to keep this guy together. Admittedly, he was doing slightly better than when I had left him a few minutes ago. The shouting was at a minimum now, and it looked like all he needed was the shot to help him relax. I approached him with the syringe and told him I would be giving him a shot, and obviously, he became paranoid because, again, he was perceiving us as trying to harm him. After a little more calming him down, I prepared to give him the shot in his right shoulder. I lifted up his t-shirt sleeve, cleaned the site, and grabbed the muscle while he was talking to one of the police officers. I told him that I was going to stick him and gave him the customary 1, 2, 3 countdown as I stuck the needle into his shoulder. A quick explanation of my shot-giving technique is necessary before moving ahead. When I give a shot, I hold the syringe by the barrel like you would hold a dart before throwing it, between my thumb and index finger with the needle pointing towards the patient, obviously. After the needle is in, I make a split-second move where I rotate my hand so that the barrel of the syringe is between my index and middle fingers, much like you would hold a cigarette. From there, my thumb is free to push the plunger and administer the medication. Anyway, shortly after I stick the needle in this guy, he apparently forgot that I would be sticking him despite my warning not seconds before. He proceeded to freak out at the worst possible time. He turned to look at his arm, clearly alarmed by the syringe poking out of him. At this point, I was getting ready to switch my grip on the syringe from the dart grip to the cigarette grip, but his reaction to getting stuck caused him to pull away from me just as my grip was changing. He leaned to his left and the syringe stayed in his arm as he moved away. From there, he pulled the syringe and still attached needle from his arm with his left hand, raised it, and went after me with it as a weapon. The officers reacted by this point and start to go for the guy to stop him. I heard one of them shout needle, which I assume was the police way of calling out the weapon present in the room. As they're subduing him, his momentum continued towards me. Still shocked, I tried my best to get out of the way, but still felt an impact as something hit my left thigh. The syringe and needle fell to the floor and I saw that the needle was bent. By now, almost everyone in the room was on the patient, who was now screaming at the top of his lungs as staff worked to restrain him to the bed. I reached for the needle and syringe simply to get it out of the way for everyone else and to make sure that everyone had everything they needed during the restraint. At this point, I began to realize exactly what had happened and that I had been attacked. Oh God, please don't tell me that needle hit me. I was terrified thinking of what diseases and nasty shit this guy potentially had that I was exposed to. While contemplating my future life with HIV and hepatitis, I stepped into the bathroom to inspect the damage to my leg. I was so relieved when I found my leg was unscathed. The only explanation I can think of is that somehow the needle hit the pack of gum that was in my left pocket at the time. Wrigley, if you ever need a spokesperson, please have your people get in contact with my people. After the situation had resolved, one of the police officers approached me and asked if I wanted to press charges against the guy. I initially said no because I felt sorry for the guy. He had psychiatric problems, he can't control what he's doing. As that shift progressed, however, my feelings began to change. Why should I protect this guy because he was methed out of his mind and attacked me? Why should I let this guy get away with giving me anxiety and making me feel uneasy for the rest of my career with psych patients? I later called the officer back and pressed charges against the patient. As of about 2 years ago, nothing has come of the charges because the patient wasn't in his right mind. Again, please, for everyone's sake, don't do meth. This next story is from the same person, so consider it a continuation. After a couple of years of career development, I found myself in a leadership role in the ER. I had been given the title of night shift charge nurse over my department and my confidence was high. I finally had the opportunity to show everyone my leadership skills and how well I could run the department. I truly thought I could make a difference. On this night, one of our ambulances got called for a car versus semi collision. The patient was the driver of the car and was in his 30s or 40s. The medics in the ambulance mentioned that the collision may have been intentional as a suicide attempt. There was no obvious injuries that I noted when he first arrived and he appeared to be calm. When I saw that the situation was under control, I stepped back and looked over the rest of the department. I didn't hear anything about him for the rest of the time that he was there. I don't remember why, but he was going to be admitted to the hospital. So the nurse called report to the floor and we arranged for transport to his room upstairs. Because he could have possibly attempted suicide, he was placed in a 1-to-1 watch while he was in the ER, so the tech that was doing the watch was going to take him upstairs. Additionally, because he was a 1-to-1 watch, they needed to be escorted by a security guard. According to the tech, he had been asleep for quite some time prior to his transport. The security guard arrived and the tech woke the patient up for the transport. Once he woke up, all hell broke loose. He immediately got up from the bed and began talking nonsense, eventually escalating to yelling nonsense. With my workstation being right outside the room, I got up and went straight into the room. When I entered through the curtain, I saw the tech and the security guard standing opposite of the guy trying to talk him down. At this point, the guy was standing in the middle of the room, bare-ass naked, and had ripped out his IV. His posturing was threatening and things looked like it would get violent unless the situation diffused. The security guard immediately called for backup and calmly tried to approach the patient. It was at this point that the guy attacked the guard by punching him in the face. The patient continued to go after the guard, but the guard managed to get him pinned against some cabinets in the room. I stepped up to try to hold the patient's arms back. I yelled for the secretary at the nurse's station to call the police. Not long afterward, the other security guard arrived and tried to help. To paint a better picture, the patient is standing with his back against a counter in some cabinets, still yelling nonsensically in his psychotic tangent. Security guard 1 is bear hugging him around his chest and abdomen, much like a football tackle. I'm standing by the patient's side between him and the door, doing my best to hold his arms back from hitting anybody else. Enter the second guard, who approached the patient from the front and was trying to see what he could do to help. He unfortunately got too close, and the patient saw an opportunity. He cocked his head back in a split second and headbutted the second guard in the face with full force. The patient's head struck the guard right above his brow, which immediately split open and began dripping blood. That loud, dull thud of bare skull on skull contact is a sickening sound that I will never forget. Immediately following that, we got the patient's feet out from under him and brought him down to the floor. The security guard with his head gashed open was still trying to help us and was dripping blood all over the floor and the patient. By this time, other people had heard the commotion and came to help. The secretary had called 911 and we were just waiting on the police to get there. All we had to do was keep this guy held down. Granted, this was about an average-sized guy, but he was still quite the fighter. We simply were unable to hold him down on the ground by his limbs, so I ended up kneeling with my entire weight onto his back to keep him down. Again, my entire 250-pound frame was kneeling with my entire weight on this guy's back and was barely phasing him. He kept shouting for his little buddy to come save him so that they could run away to Alaska or something like that. When I think back on the situation, it was honestly kinda sad. This guy was clearly having a psychotic episode and didn't intentionally try to harm us. But in that moment, all I felt was rage. White, hot, boiling rage for what he did to my coworkers and friends. If I knew there wouldn't be any repercussions for my actions, I can't say that I wouldn't have beaten the absolute piss out of the guy in the moment. After the police arrived, we were able to get the patient restrained to the bed and sedated him without any issue. Once the situation was more under control, we registered both of the security guards for treatment. The first guard had no injuries and the other guard had his wound stitched up. Other than the wound on his head and being slightly dazed, he was fine. No one else was injured during the event. Shortly after I walked out of the room, the gravity of what had just happened hit me really hard. I quickly made my way to an empty room and closed the door before I absolutely lost it. I sobbed as silently as I could as I contemplated what had just happened. This guy had just gone full-blown apeshit on us and there was absolutely nothing I could do. I was the leader of these people, and they were put into a dangerous situation in what is supposed to be one of the safest places in the community. One of my responsibilities was to keep things under control, and I had just messed that up in a major way. Maybe I wasn't as capable of doing this job as I thought. I took a few minutes to let my emotions run their course and collected myself before heading back out to finish the shift. Not long after that incident, I stepped down from being a charge nurse, both for reasons related and unrelated to these events. I've since gone back to being a regular staff nurse in the ER, and I honestly prefer that. I haven't gone back to the charge nurse role again and most likely never will. I still get anxious before every shift I work, always worrying about what dangerous situation my coworkers and I may face in the ensuing 12-hour shift. I'm a night shift nurse who has been working at a veterans hospital for the past 3 years. My unit is located at the basement of the hospital. I chose to do 12-hour night shifts because it was quiet and relaxing for the most part before the rush begins in the morning after we leave. Last night, I was sitting at the nurses' station at 12:30 a.m. catching up on The Walking Dead, and I had the urge to use the restroom. I go into the restroom, do my business, and everything seemed completely normal. This restroom is a unisex restroom, so the entire staff uses it. As I process to head to the sink to wash my hands and kind of stare at my face in the mirror to see if I look tired enough yet, I hear a slow sliding sound coming from one of the ceiling tiles above. It moves open, exposing the roofing, and just sits there. Now, I'm not the bravest person in the world, but since my curiosity hasn't killed me yet, I decided to hide behind the wall that divided the main sink from the stalls and just wait quietly to see what was going on up there. In the midst of this silence, a man's legs began creeping out from the roof opening. This is when I knew I had to officially run. I was practically shitting bricks at this point. He drops into the restroom as I'm flinging the door open and screaming bloody murder into the hallway of sleeping patients. He grabs the back of my scrubs and we both fall to the floor. My coworkers, who most definitely got startled as hell, ran to my rescue. They separated us, thank God. However, I had a faint scratch on my right cheek. He had a pair of wound care scissors in his hand. Security was called as my male coworkers detained him. I was in a state of hysteria and was ready to go home in the middle of the shift. It turned out the young man was a newly admitted psych patient who was trying to escape from the upper hospital floors. Apparently, his family forcefully brought him to the emergency room, and they were waiting for him to get cleared to go to psych. No one is completely sure how he could get away and end up in the restroom ceiling. The freaking restroom ceiling. Currently, my nursing supervisor and I have decided to switch me to work morning shifts now, but on a different unit. Unfortunately, after this event, now I really know what authentic fear feels like.